Well, here you are, and here we are at an historic event. It's the end of this sermon series. We've been at it quite a while, and some important themes have made themselves known. And what I want to do is talk about those themes. And then it was really hard to know what direction to go in terms of concluding. But then I thought about the responses that this series has generated from some of you, and I thought I'd let those responses lead the way and choose what kind of big ideas we talk about. So we'll talk about your responses and then zoom out and look at some bigger issues. That's what we're doing this morning. We have been asking about early Genesis, what would these stories and genealogies have meant to the ancient Israelites who originally heard them? That's been our question. We've been asking, what did they mean, these stories and genealogies? And we've been asking, how did they mean? How did they communicate meaning? What kind of literature is this, anyway? Those are big questions, and they have required some big ideas. The biggest and most important theme in this series has been the original context of the ancient Near East. Because we simply cannot understand early Genesis well if we don't also understand the conceptual background against which it sticks out like something radical and new. So as you've heard many times from me, the ancient Near East already had creation stories. The ancient Near East already had flood stories, already had genealogies that were linked to those flood stories, already had archetypal stories that were designed to explore what we call theology, cosmology, sociology, anthropology, ethics, and political science, but all wrapped up in story form, so therefore interesting. That literature already existed, and those pre-existing ancient Near Eastern worldview stories were just known. Much the same way that our Cinderella story is just known. So the ancient Israelites knew what to expect. They knew what was normal, and early Genesis did not deliver normal. Instead, it played off those expectations to deliver radically good news about God and about the world and about what it means to be human. So that's one theme that came up over and over. A second theme is that the literature of early Genesis was and is not children's literature. These were stories by grown-ups, for grown-ups, exploring very grown-up issues. I have said that generally, evangelical churches, and I'm approaching this from the evangelical perspective because that's where most of us here have come from. Generally, evangelical churches do a good job of introducing children to the stories of early Genesis in age-appropriate ways. We have a lot of picture books and flannel graphs, as we discussed last week, and Sunday school lessons. But as we grow up, and as we become able to engage more fully and thoughtfully with this ancient grown-up literature and all of its depth and richness and beauty, as we become able to do this, the church's teaching often does not keep pace. And for many people, the worldview stories of early Genesis get, to repeat myself just because I'm proud of this, trapped in the amber of childhood. And we turn this grown-up literature into children's literature. And as a result, we end up with overly simplistic interpretations that do not pass reality tests. And that ends up causing problems and heartaches. And we'll come back to some of those problems. The third big theme in this series has been the image of the Israelites waiting at the base of Mount Sinai. We tend to remember that Moses brought down the Ten Commandments, but that was not all. We have to keep reminding ourselves that those commandments were just one part of something bigger, the offer of a relationship with Yahweh, what we call the covenant. But as part of that offer, there needed to be a proclamation of Yahweh's character. Yahweh wants to have a covenant with you, make a covenant with you. Well, who's that? And the worldview stories of early Genesis performed exactly that function, explaining what God was like and laying out Yahweh's intentions for humanity and for the world. So think of the covenant and the Ten Commandments and the worldview stories of early Genesis as all arriving at roughly the same time for the Israelites. And all together, they called the Israelites to join a revolution. And in hearing and responding to that call, in the context of what was considered normal in all the surrounding ancient Near Eastern cultures, including overwhelmingly powerful empires, the Israelites had some very grown-up work to do. And amazingly enough, they did it. Not perfectly, of course, and they've preserved that for us as well, but Israel did develop a culture that was, in many ways, radically different from anything else in the ancient Near East. In large part because of these early Genesis passages. And we still benefit from that today, by the way, because normal, even in our secular setting, normal has shifted away from what was typical in the ancient Near East toward something much closer to the good news proclaimed in early Genesis. When you think about individual human rights and equality for all people, that is a far, far cry from normal in the ancient Near East and far, far closer to what is proclaimed in early Genesis. So those were some of our big ideas. Now, I have received some feedback from you who are here in person and from those who listen online, and there have been a variety of responses. Some have expressed relief. Something like, finally, a way to understand these stories that makes sense. Now I don't have to stand at a distance and squint to make these things work. Some have expressed anger, but not at me, necessarily. Why have I not heard this before? I feel like I've been misled all my life. Others have expressed skepticism. These are the fun ones. Some as statements and some as questions. Here are the statements. Statements have been like this. Well, Paul, you've given us a lot to think about. Or sometimes just a two-word review. Thought-provoking. Which generally means interesting, but probably wrong. And also, these statements imply you might just be making this up. Those are the skeptical statements. The skeptical questions have been like this. Paul, it almost feels like just asking for a friend, you know? Paul, has anyone pushed back on these sermons? Do you have people asking you hard questions? Implying someone ought to. And then at the newcomers' lunch, I received this from an unnamed individual. I will not name this person. Paul, I'm just loving this series, watching you up there, all smiles, all politeness, and totally stirring the you-know-what. And I protested this description. Ben and Andrea were there. I'm naming them. But did they stick up for me? No, they did not. They turned to this person and they just said this. Shh, don't tell Paul he's doing that. He doesn't know. Now, rather than dwell on the specifics of those comments or dwell on whether or not I am a smiling, polite, you-know-what stirrer, we're going to step back. I want to step back and think about the bigger picture, about the issues that those comments and questions sort of all assume. But before we get into that, I want to show you the resources I used to try to demonstrate that I'm not just making these things up. So if you are listening online, the YouTube version of the sermon audio will include pictures of these books. Okay, hold on. This will be fast-ish. The same man who wrote the prayer we heard this morning, Walter Brueggemann, wrote a commentary on Genesis. It's wonderfully helpful. You can see I've made use. And The analysis of the Eden story is a story about freedom and who gets it. The analysis of the flood story with God's character development, that is from Walter, as I call him. This commentary, which is a full, thick book that looks like it could be a Bible itself, is a commentary on the first third of Genesis. So it takes 3 of these to get through Genesis. Again, really helpful stuff on genealogies, how to understand them, what was normal in the ancient Near East, and just also more literal, raw translations of the Hebrew that gives you a sense of what's going on in the Hebrew. The kind of translations that wouldn't really work to sell, but work if you want to get an idea of what's going on in the Hebrew.
By whom?
By somebody Hamilton. On the book it just says Hamilton. That's how I just know him as Hamilton. Victor Hamilton. Maybe the most important book for me when it comes to rethinking early Genesis has been this one, Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament. And then the subtitle, Introducing the Conceptual World of the Hebrew Bible. This is by John Walton, who is no raving radical. He taught at Moody Bible Institute and then moved on to Wheaton College. So we're talking about right down the middle of evangelicalism. But he talks a lot about how early Genesis works in the context of the ancient Near East. And I have from him also The Lost World of Genesis 1. And he too wrote a commentary on the book of Genesis, which was very helpful. You might have heard me say sometimes we are too busy reading between the lines when we should just be reading the lines and see what the author has in mind for us. And that comes from this. And many other things come from that. Also in the evangelical world, Bruce Waltke, who used to teach at Regent College, he's really good at looking at the structure of literature. And so when I showed you the flood story and how it was so carefully structured to funnel us into a central point, that comes from Bruce. Also from Regent College, Ian Provan, who is an Old Testament specialist. And this book, the title is clever, Seriously Dangerous Religion. And the subtitle is What the Old Testament Really Says and Why It Matters. Maybe one of my personal academic, this might be the peak for me academically because I'm in one footnote. Ooh. Also, he wrote a shorter book on Genesis here. So Ian Provan, very, very careful thinker. It was from him that I learned about why the Genesis goes out of its way not to say sun, not to say moon, because the names in Hebrew sounded like the names of the sun god and the moon god. And the idea of the temple lamp and everything that comes from him. Moving slightly away from, pardon me?
This is an incredible library you've used.
We all have hobbies. Right? And others have lives. Peter Enns, who used to be quite safely ensconced in the evangelical world and found himself kicked out. He didn't really want to leave, but his scholarship led to some blowback. But anyway, this is a really interesting book, The Evolution of Adam, and it's about how Jews and Christians over the millennia have perceived the character Adam in the Eden story and the different kinds of interpretations that have been made from it. It's very, very interesting. And he also wrote with Jared Bias, the Genesis for Normal People, and they have a pretty famous podcast, The Bible for Normal People, the only God-ordained podcast on the internet. And finally, a book by someone who's not in the Christian world at all, I don't believe. He's a researcher at a British museum, and he happened upon, quite recently, this is a pretty recent book, he happened upon a clay tablet that no one had bothered to translate, so he started to translate it, and what do you know? It was yet another ancient Near Eastern flood story, and that had the same kind of patterns that we've been talking about, so just another confirmation of what normal looked like back in the ancient Near East. The one difference is this one called for the ark to be round like a bowl and made out of something almost like wicker and then coated with all sorts of tar and pitch. So just a round bowl floating on the floodwaters. Okay, there, those are my books. I'll leave them up here if you want to look at them afterwards. Okay, back to your feedback. The comments I received, the ones that were lighthearted and the ones that were serious, all actually stem from this fact. There are tensions in the evangelical world around early Genesis. New ways of thinking about or understanding early Genesis can, in the evangelical world, feel like a threat. And I want to ask why that is. Because we're quite happy, generally, to rethink our understanding of a psalm. We're quite happy to rethink our understanding of a parable of Jesus. Jesus' own words we're happy to rethink. Our understanding of the suffering of Jesus changes as we mature and we can understand it more. Our understanding of the utter and complete shock of the resurrection changes as we mature. Our understandings of the raw and honest portrayals of the very imperfect Old Testament and New Testament characters changes as we mature and we have more wisdom and more grace as we understand we are those people. So why in the evangelical community are we not invited to do the same sort of thing when it comes to early Genesis? As you've just seen with my little show and tell up here, even if you never ever leave the evangelical cocoon, the material about the ancient Near East and literary analysis of early Genesis that I presented in this sermon series, they're all available inside that evangelical world. Most of these books were from evangelical publishers or authors, and most within the last 25 years. So it's out there. Why the gap between evangelical scholarship and evangelical churches? So I have some imperfect ideas about that. The first one, often, pastors and leaders in churches and volunteers in high school, Sunday school programs and things just don't know. Just don't know about this. Depending on where they were educated, pastors might not have been taught about the ancient Near Eastern context of early Genesis. And it's not always malevolent. It's just a lack of knowledge and a lack of education. But on the other hand, even if evangelical church leaders do know about these things, they also know that revisiting early Genesis is a minefield. In large part because of the so-called war between science and the Bible. And I have some first-hand experience with this tension as someone who's been brought into various situations as a guest speaker / sacrificial lamb to talk about how Christianity and science can go together. Specifically, to talk about how Christianity and evolution can go together. And if the setting I'm brought into is even vaguely evangelical, invariably I have to talk about early Genesis. Because people have been set up, purposefully or not, set up to think about early Genesis and evolution as being at odds with each other, if not involved in a spiritual battle. Which to me is very sad and ironic, actually, since I believe with all my heart that a careful study of early Genesis, like these evangelical scholars have done over here, a careful study dissolves the tension, if you had any. And I want to just show you why I believe that. And that'll be basically the remaining part of this sermon, just showing you why I think that. And I want to start by returning to an analogy that I sort of skipped over very briefly earlier in this sermon series. Here's the setup. We all know that Christian missionaries have gone into cultures different from their own with the intention of sharing the gospel, with the intention of sharing the good news about the God of love. But we also know that all too often those missionaries did far more than share the gospel. They also ignored or harmed the cultures they went into. These missionaries confused their home culture with Christian culture. They thought their home culture was the only way to be Christian, the only way to have culture. They universalized themselves. It has happened all over the world. It has happened here on this land. So here's the analogy that I use cautiously because the intensity of hurt is so very different. When we read early Genesis, as if it were a modern, historical, scientific report of what happened, we're doing the same kind of thing as those missionaries, of course in a toned down way. Because when we read early Genesis, what we ought to do is enter into its ancient Near Eastern culture that was very different from our own. Ancient Near Eastern people had different priorities than we do. They had a different world picture. They had their own literary forms in which they explored serious grown-up issues, but differently. And it's in the context of that culture that early Genesis does its work in ways that those people would have understood. But if we insist on reading early Genesis like a modern historical scientific report, we confuse our home culture with biblical culture. We make the mistake of thinking that our kind of literature is the only kind of literature that the Bible is allowed to be. We universalize ourselves. In other words, when we impose our intellectual culture on the Bible, we're committing a kind of intellectual imperialism. And not only is that arrogant and violent, like all imperialism, but it also means we end up misreading early Genesis in a way that pits it against the sciences in a completely unnecessary and destructive way. And it also means that we miss out on so many beautiful messages in early Genesis. We miss the gospel that's in there. Now, we have tried to hear that gospel in this sermon series. We've tried to enter into normal ancient Near Eastern culture and hear early Genesis the way it was intended to be heard. I'd like to read you a little montage of some of the conclusions that have been in the sermons in this series. God is a loving creator, not self-centered, not worried about a chaos dragon, and capable of both deep delight and rest. The world brings God delight. The world is good. It is a gift. We are image bearers. We are here to rule, but lovingly, like God does, as caretakers, motivated by delight. And we are called to rest in this good, big, beautiful world. All of it sacred space. Early Genesis proclaims this kind of thing is for everybody. We are all of us image bearers, not just the resume people. Everybody. Freedom is for everyone too, not just the very few at the top. And early Genesis helped the Israelites think about freedom in a new way, in a way that aimed to bring freedom and flourishing to all, not just the few. That was radical news then, and it still is now. God is a loving, caring, loyal provider of good things. The world is a gift. All people, all of them, all of us, are made in the image of God. Or to put it another way, God is the artist of love. The world is the gift of God's art. And every person is an artist in residence. That's enough of quoting myself. So, we can hear in that a pattern in what early Genesis proclaimed to the Israelites in their ancient Near Eastern context. Early Genesis, and this is what I want to end with, laid the foundation of a theology of delight. A theology of delight. Even the Garden of Eden could be translated Garden of Delight. So it's right there. There are so many places we could go from that, from a theology of delight. We could think about art, and we have in this church this year, starting at the church retreat and just a few weeks ago on the art panel. We could think about, from a theology of delight, environmental care. We could think about work-life balance and the practice of Sabbath. We could think about how a theology of delight actually helps us understand the entire biblical meta-narrative. But this morning, keeping our focus narrow, I just want to return to that tension that some people feel or have grown up feeling between early Genesis and science. And I just want to show you how, once we hear the theology of delight that was proclaimed to the ancient Israelites, that tension between Genesis and science just goes away completely. Science, just going to be some obvious statements. Science is the study of the natural world. The natural world, Christians believe, is created by God. For Christians, then, science and the doctrine of creation should be intimately linked. Add to that this theology of delight, which surrounds and upholds and infuses the doctrine of creation as we read it in early Genesis. That's why I wanted to read that paraphrase by Robert Farrar Capon at the beginning of this service. What did we hear in his deliberately ridiculous paraphrase? We heard a theology of delight. We heard that the world is here precisely because God delights in it. We heard that we are here because God delights in us. And we heard that as image bearers, we are invited into this dance of delight. And I want to add something to that, and that is that through the Sabbath, also introduced in early Genesis, we humans are called to join God in resting, in making time to do those things that mark us as being made in the image of God. We are called to see, to name, to know, and to delight in God's good creation. See, name, know, delight. What better reasons could there be to do science? If we start with a theology of delight, there is no tension between science and the Bible, because science is one aspect of what we do as image bearers. We explore and see and name and know and love and delight in this gift of a world. Now, we do that in a lot of other ways besides science, too. Art, storytelling, literature, dance, poetry, acts of love and mercy and caretaking. In all of these things, we explore the mystery of the infinitely beautiful and infinitely interesting world that has been given to us. So rather than somehow being a threat to our faith, science, through a theology of delight, is just one of the ways we experience the world's mystery. Science is part of a never-ending learning that is our worshipful response to God's goodness. With each scientific discovery, we're able to experience a little more of God's great art. Read a little more in God's book of creation. Learn a few more steps in the eternal dance of delight. That's what science can do for us. So as our understanding, speaking of evolution, as our understanding of the long history of life on this planet grows, so too can our delight grow in the great artist behind it all. We thought the world was a painting. Turns out it's a movie. As the Bible says, more than we could ask or imagine. All to say, when we enter into the culture of early Genesis respectfully, we see that there is no contradiction whatsoever with our scientific findings. The reverse, in fact. In early Genesis, we find a theology of delight that tells us it is wonderful to learn as much as we can about this world, as much as we can about God's great art. Here we are, in what the poet Mary Oliver calls this wild and precious life. See it, love it, name it, delight in it. Amen.